Okay. I'm gonna wait a couple minutes just to make sure we've got everyone. There's already a couple questions up here, so I just wanna tell you guys what I'm answering. Some have asked when I'll send out the peer review essays. Probably later in the day tomorrow, just because they're not officially due until tonight. So I want to get everyone a chance to turn them in. And then they won't be due, your comments won't be due until the end of the day on Friday. You'll only have to give comments on one person's paper. So I think 48 hours to read one of your classmates' papers should be enough. Let me know if for some reason it's not going to work though. And then it doesn't have to be like, your final version of the paper, but it would help you to have it be as close to being complete as possible. And then you can get more relevant feedback to really polishing up your paper. Same thing with like citations. You don't have to have citations turned in, but if you want to get feedback on if you're formatting them correctly, it'd help you to have them included in your paper already. Peer review comments will be turned in just like how you submitted your draft. So I created a Dropbox on Icon for this week. It's literally called peer review comments, if I remember correctly. So just resubmit either the document that you wrote your comments on, or like I suggested in the email earlier this week, you can just like use the comment function on Word or PDF and then just submit it with those comments still visible. And I'll return that document to the original author. I'll scan through them if anything looks to be completely, wrong, or if for some reason someone doesn't give feedback back, I'll make sure you get at least some comments. So I'm not going to give crazy extensive notes, but I will look through it just to make sure that you're going in the right direction. Is there any limit on how much we're supposed to comment back? No, there's not really a limit or like a specific amount, as long as you're giving, actual relevant, helpful feedback to them. That's really what I'm looking for. Don't not write anything or just, write good job for the entirety of the paper. That's not helpful, so like you wouldn't receive full credit for your peer reviewing if that's all you write. So I do want you to actually submit, relevant feedback. Is there a length requirement for the draft? No. Try and shoot for the length that the final paper is supposed to be at. If I'm remembering correctly, it's 3 to 5 pages. So theoretically, this draft should be an almost completed version of your paper. So 3 to 5 pages should be the length that I'm getting, and I'm not counting citations when I say 3 to 5 pages either. So shoot for that. I'm not going to take off points if you're, on the outside bounds of that range because you need to, get it edited down maybe, or you need advice on what to add into it. That's what this is kind of supposed to be for, to help you get that advice. But that's the 3 to 5 is what you should be shooting for, at least. Okay, lots of paper questions, which is good. That's fine. I'm actually just gonna switch my slide over then, so environmental security. But here's my admin slide where I was going to make sure I hit all of these questions. So rough drafts are due by midnight. Do you have any guidelines on how many citations or what kind of information you're looking to be cited? I don't have a specific number of citations. I think you probably need at least 3, I think, to make, solid argument. Anything that isn't common knowledge should be cited in your paper. So that can mean something that you learned in class here. That can be, one of the resources that I provided to you guys, or something that you found on your own when you were out doing research for this paper. But you should cite anything that you would expect, like a common person to actually have the information already in their heads, right? Anything like that should have a formal citation. Mm-hmm. This paper is more Hannah's asking how much of it should be your opinion versus how much of it should be backed by research papers. So it should be a good mix, but you can't make statements arguing about what changes you want to be making to a policy without supporting why those changes are, good, or why they make sense, or how they would work, right? So the initial idea for your argument should come from your own critical thinking about whatever policy topic you've chosen, but it still needs to be supported by that outside research that you've done. So if you want to think about the example that I've been using when I wrote up the brief for this paper, for that South Korea simulation that we did earlier in class, you were given, you were kind of, what is China doing in that region? How much money would it actually cost to do those things? How easy would it be to implement that policy? So you can still have, so I still want to see your opinions on it, but they need to be supported by facts, or you need to address the facts of the situation while you're going through your argument. Does that make sense to everyone? It's not purely opinion or purely research. It's a bit of a combination of both, which is what, what you want to do in a good argument kind of a paper is you have something new that you're contributing to this research, right? You have something new that you thought of, that's your own opinion on this topic, but you still need to support it and show how it fits into what we've previously done, what hole you're filling by creating this new idea, right? Any other questions on the paper? I have, we've talked about the peer review stuff. The only other thing I want to add is when you're submitting your drafts, if you could just not put your name on the draft itself, so I'll know who submitted each thing, because I see that on the icon drop box, but it'll make it easier for me to quickly transfer it over to whoever's going to give peer review comments and make sure they're not biased in any way, if I don't have to nix the name on every submission. So if you could just make sure your name isn't on it. If you've already submitted, you can resubmit on Dropbox really easily. So just make sure that your name isn't on the document itself, and that'll make it really easy to make sure we've got your peer review, double, or not double blind, but single blind evaluation of your papers. I'm going to give a couple seconds just to make sure that there aren't any questions coming through on the chat for me, and then I'll start talking about our substantive stuff for the day. Okay, fantastic. If you do have any questions that pop up, message me in the chat and I will try and. Okay, cool. So what we're talking about this week is change natural disasters. That's something we talk about a lot when I think when we're not in national security, what we're thinking of when we look at environmental security. But there's a couple other things that I want to make sure we cover this week so that we get the full perspective on what this actually can be when we're looking at national security issues. So energy threats can be things like, or are traditionally things like supply lines, or making sure that you have enough resources to meet your energy needs, right? So those have traditionally been things where we're trying to figure out where we can find our coal, how to build power lines, how to protect those kinds of things. And nowadays, they're more along the lines of threats to natural resources. So are we running out of our supplies? Is there something else we need to turn to? Is someone maybe limiting our access to a natural resource? A second thing that traditionally we've looked at is environmental risks to political or economic stability. So international or environmental security, understand how stability within your own country can make it either easy or hard, to make sure you've got the energy you need, or instability in another country can also have that effect, right? And that can be political or economic. So it can be, economic downturns. Is there a recession? Is the global market dropping? Or it can be concerns as simple as, do people vote consistently? Do we have, protests or revolutions happening in a country? All of those things can contribute to how difficult it is to kind of meet your security requirements as a country. right? So these are called environmental risks because it's literally things that make it more difficult to feel safe and secure within the country you're in, right? A lot of these can be connected to energy discussion. So a lot of the historical things that I'll talk about today do connect to that kind of energy concern, where the United States is trying to get the resources it needs to run, but instability or conflict in another country affects our ability to get the resources we need, right? So that's the political stability element interacting with our energy needs. And then in a more recently, I guess, the more modern interpretation of these kinds of environmental concerns is climate change, right? How does climate change affect our ability to, keep our nation secure? What issues is it creating? How can we respond to it? And then finally, I'll talk about nuclear contamination. That's definitely one that is a much further distant future concern. So I'm kind of going through these chronologically, things that have historically been issues, things that are currently issues, things that will future be issues. So we, in the Cold War, there was a lot of concern about nuclear fallout. We had, big events like Chernobyl that really showed us that making sure we can manage our nuclear waste is important. But that doesn't mean that the issue is resolved itself. We still have a lot of issues that we need to figure out and things that will go on, for thousands of years in the future, because that radiation is going to continue to exist long past any of our lifetimes. No, go back. Okay, there we go. Okay, so first I want to tell you guys what the institutions are that we've kind of created as a country to deal with these kinds of concerns, right? Because that's how we should always be trying to understand how our policies can address the issues that we're looking at. What actual institutions have we created that can implement these policies? How effective are they? When were they created? Right, so we need to understand that first. So the big one that we've got in the United States is the Environmental Security Initiative. It's actually kind of a collaborative work between a couple different government institutions that are all designed to try and address this issue of environmental security. So this collective initiative was formed in 1996. It is a collaborative work between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency. So that's what this logo is right here. That's the Environmental Protection Agency logo. Essentially, what they state and what they argue is that to ensure environmental security is to ensure long-term prosperity and stability. So a lot of the time, the issues that we're looking at when we're addressing environmental security are those long-term future concerns, not the direct immediate, like level 1 national security issues that we've talked about a lot in class. These are the more, it also is unique in that it needs to integrate current US foreign policy and kind of the international stance in the world, right? So even though we're looking at our own environmental security, it has to work with how other countries are protecting their own environmental security, and then how the United States has already established its relationship with other countries, right? We can't reach out to countries and work with them on this issue if we're not friends with them in general, right? So all of those need to be taken into account when we're looking at how these institutions address environmental security. Okay, so let's look at that first one, that idea of energy threats. These are definitely the things we've seen more historically, but are still pretty relevant. So we're going to look at political instability, foreign oil dependence, and power disruptions. So when I say power disruptions, I literally mean like the power grid, electricity, when those get disrupted. So we'll look at those 3 issues and kind of explore how they've been addressed before. So to do the political instability kind of topic, a little bit mixed in with our dependence on foreign oil, the oil embargo that happened in 1973 and continued on through 1974 was between the United States and several OPEC countries, mainly including Saudi Arabia. So what happened in this event was there was a Middle East conflict at the time called the Arab-Israeli War. And the United States was put in a difficult spot from a foreign policy perspective, where it was trying to support Israel, but relied on the foreign oil supplied by Saudi Arabia. So they still needed to maintain a fairly positive relationship with Saudi Arabia, even though it was clearly supporting the other side of the conflict, right? So what happened was once the United States actually supplied, additional support to Israel during this conflict, the the OPEC countries, which are the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they actually created an embargo on the United States' supply of foreign oil. So they decided that the United States would be restricted from buying their oil because it had shown that it was willing to support Israel over Saudi Arabia. So it restricted US access to it, and it also decreased the general production of oil. So oil became scarcer, and the United States could not buy oil from one of the most popular suppliers in the world. So what that did was essentially just boost up the price of oil like dramatically, right? Not only did they decrease supply, they increased demand essentially by the United States because they had fewer suppliers to go to. The United States was not alone in this. The Netherlands, Portugal, South Africa were also included in this embargo, but it created a lot of strain for the United States and essentially created a security risk, right? This picture right here is literally cars that have been abandoned in the street because they ran out of gas, right? There was a gasoline shortage in the country, the prices skyrocketed, but you need to be in a car to get anywhere in the United States, essentially. So it became a real strain on the economy, on how the government worked, on like people's ability to function, essentially. Yeah, so a strain on the US economy. Essentially, oh, that's a typo. I'll fix this. Oil prices, not process, oil prices quadrupled during this time period. And then the value of the US dollar also dropped. So we were essentially being forced into a recession where not only was oil more expensive, each dollar could buy less of it. So it really put a strain on the average American. The thing that stopped this was the first Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreement that was negotiated at the beginning of 1974. It was an attempt to create kind of a peace treaty or an armistice between the other Middle Eastern countries and Israel. It didn't really hold, but it did show that there was a chance for kind of peace to be negotiated between the two of those groups. So that was enough to kind of show OPEC that the United States' ability to maintain its, energy stores. If a single country could decide to cut off our oil supply, you can't let the entire state collapse, right? That's not really a viable way to run our government. That wouldn't work at all. So now that the United States knew that this was an issue that they needed to address, there were a couple changes that they had to make. The first was creating a strategic oil reserve or a strategic petroleum reserve. This image right here shows a couple of those reserves in the Gulf. So Bryan Mound, Big Hill, West Hackenberry, and the Bayou Choctaw. So that if for some reason the United States ever gets cut off from foreign oil supplies, we have a stockpile. We'll be able to function for a bit before we completely run out of everything. Economically, this has given us a bit of stability, so the United States is able to respond to those kinds of foreign pressures a bit better. If we need to, we can actually sell that oil. It's the president is given power to sell that oil to foreign countries if we need kind of the economic boost from it. So it also gives us a bit more play there. But other side effects of this issue that I think maybe aren't as well known, or at least aren't commonly talked about, the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was put in because of this oil embargo. It's not really a safety issue or anything like that that makes us have that speed limit normally. It's purely because it's the most fuel efficient mile per hour to drive in for long distances. So it makes us less reliant on foreign oil if we're stuck traveling at that kind of a speed where we're using the least amount of gas as possible. There was a push to create more fuel economy standards in our cars. So fuel efficient cars really kind of the idea for them started after this crisis. And then the creation of an international energy agency to kind of create at least some sort of international regulation for this, general oil sharing process. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions about the oil embargo? Well, I pull up this beautiful chart. Go ahead and type them up if you have them. So what this is the price for a big drum of oil internationally as the years have gone on. So you can see as we go through the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s, it's pretty, okay, I need to remember I'm pointing backwards. Over here, you can kind of see that holds pretty steady. And this big jump that we've got right here is 1973 to 74, right? So as soon as that embargo comes in, the price of oil skyrockets. And it holds actually pretty close to that rate for a while. It drops down a bit, but it's still, moving around. And then for fun current events kind of stuff, this is the oil price right now. It's actually $0. It's ridiculously cheap to buy oil right now, probably because no one is driving or going anywhere. So the demand has dramatically reduced, and probably OPEC hasn't been able to reduce its production at all. And there's less of a reliance on that organization as well to get that foreign oil. So it's really cheap to buy oil if you want. You could probably buy a big drum yourself and just keep it if you wanted to. How cheap it is. Interesting little map. Okay. Haley has a question. Will it spike when Corona is over? Oh, probably. Yeah. I mean, it might not go all the way to the top of this map, but it'll probably come back up a bit. I know that there's been, I think it was literally today, there were some news articles about wanting to, refill up our oil reserves, because right now is the best time to buy oil. So that might be what we plan on doing, so we can, buy low, sell high. But we'll see how it goes. But yeah, I'm assuming it'll go up at least a bit once Corona comes back. It's all supply and demand. Yeah. Okay, so, right, I'm saying it's all supply and demand, but is there anything we can do to maybe, it's currently being stored in tankers because there's too much supply. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, and people are gonna hold on to it like that because they know that the price will go back up soon. It's literally just because no one's driving. But yeah, definitely. Okay, so I talked about how the plan or the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit that we had was part of this plan to increase fuel efficiency. There are other things we can do. So the article that I was pulling a lot of these recommendations from is from 2011. And some of these things are actually happening right now, so that's fun. Hybrid vehicles would be a great help for it, right? If we just have less of a reliance on gasoline itself. Looking at alternative fuel sources would be another way to kind of reduce that dependence on foreign oil. And then finally, working from home. If you just didn't have to drive into work for 2 out of the 5 days you go to work, then you could dramatically reduce how much oil or how much gasoline the country needs, which I'm pretty sure is exactly what we're seeing in the gas prices right now, is that everyone's working from home. So you've dramatically decreased demand, and that's why the price has gone down. So we're literally showing that we can address our dependence on foreign oil by enacting some of these changes. It's just we've never had the push to do that big of a change, right? So when we reduce our dependence on foreign oil, what we're essentially doing is separating the security of the United States from the whims or the political desires of another country, right? Because we were always dependent on those countries that had a greater supply of that oil. And if we can work to separate ourselves from that relationship, then we can focus on, other issues of security instead of having to rely on making sure that. Okay, so that is the last bit I have on foreign oil dependence. Any questions on that? And if I don't see anything pop up, then I will start talking about power disruptions. So rolling blackouts, massive power disruptions or losses, right? Those are all kind of things that we need to be thinking about. They do happen. They happen not frequently, but they have happened a bunch of different times. So it's not like that's a non-existent concern. There's a lot of different things that can cause these power disruptions. I think the ones that they had in New York in the 70s, a lot of it was if you don't maintain the power lines or the transformers. And then weather calamities like storms, flooding, fires. That's kind of what we saw in California over the summer, at least at the beginning of it. If the fires burn down the power lines, then you don't get any more power, right? Cyber attacks are also a more recent concern that we've had when we're looking at power disruption. So Los Angeles and Salt Lake City have both had their power grids knocked out by DOS attacks, which are denial of service attacks. It's essentially just spamming a website until it crashes, right? But they just did that to the energy grid and crashed the energy grid for that city. So also not good. Here's a perfect example of it. This image is from the Super Bowl from a few years ago, where there was essentially a poorly maintained relay within the stadium that was supposed to prevent outages, but it kind of like shorted a bit and pretty much knocked out power for the entire stadium for like 20 minutes. That's a big security risk if the cops can't get power, or if major municipal buildings can't get power, if you can't support the other like the water system or the sewer system or schooling or heating in the winter or air conditioning in the summer, right? If you can't get power to supply to those kinds of resources, then that's going to put a lot of people at risk, right? So it's definitely a problem that we want to address. Brian is asking, reminds me of what happened on caucus night. Yeah, essentially, right? If we don't have the infrastructure that we kind of assume exists, and if it's not there for us when we need it, then bad stuff happens and we kind of run around with our heads cut off because we don't know what we're doing. So I could definitely see that. Okay, so I know that you're political science majors. I'm not going to assume that you know how every power plant works, but I do want to at least show you the steps to it. Certain sources were used historically and why we have the potential for alternative sources now. This image is not showing up well on the projector, but it's just a diagram of what I'm about to say. So if you are looking at it at home, that's essentially what you're looking at. Oh, the power went out at the IMU during caucus night? I did not know that. That's weird. All right. Okay, so how a power plant works. Essentially, you have a fuel source, so historically like coal. You have a fuel source that you are burning, and you put like a big bucket of water over it, and that burning fuel source heats up the water and creates steam. Then you use that steam to push the fan of a turbine, which moves from heat energy to mechanical energy, right? You're taking something that was just an item that you're burning, and you're using it to spin a rod. And as you spin that turbine, that creates electricity, right? If you put it into a turbine. So what you're doing is burning the fuel to heat up the water, to create steam, to spin a turbine, to generate energy. It doesn't really matter what you're burning as long as it's creating that kind of heat output to create steam and turn the turbine. Once you have turned that turbine, that's where the electricity is generated. And then from a more infrastructure standpoint, we use transformers to convert that electricity into the proper voltage where it can move along power lines. And then we use power lines to transport that electricity from the power plant to the houses or hospitals or buildings that need it, right? So you need all of those steps to work. If the transformer blows, then there's no way to get the energy to the houses. If the power lines go down, you can't move the energy, right? And if we don't have fuel to burn, you can't generate the energy. So you need all of those pieces working together to fully create the power and the electricity that the country needs to operate. Any questions on that? If you want, when you're looking at your PowerPoint, there's a little diagram right here that kind of explains it as well. It's just a pretty thin line, so it's not showing up super great on the projector, I don't think. But yes. Okay. All right, so because there's so many different ways for us to heat up that water to create that steam, there's a lot of alternatives to the traditional kind of coal or even like wood to create our energy required. We can use solar energy. You can just use the sun to spin those turbines. Hydro energy, so water-based. Geothermal, waste product that we've already got. Can we use that existing waste to create that heat energy we need? So all of these are different alternatives we can use to, again, reduce our dependence on foreign oil and hopefully reduce, in the case of like the biomass, or maybe in these three options, reduce our reliance on non-renewable resources and maybe just use things that are lying around that we're not paying a ton of attention to right now. Badri is asking, does the US import oil from other countries besides Saudi Arabia? Yes. Saudi Arabia was just the big player in that event, but OPEC is actually a an organization of a bunch of different countries in the Middle East that are producing oil. They're just usually the most like politically active when we're talking about big historical events of the US. Yep. Ways to generate that power, and I've talked about how we generate the power, but how do we actually fix that kind of disruption issue, right? So I've said that they happen a lot, that there's a lot of different things that can cause them. How do we actually prevent those disruptions from happening, right? One way that's kind of mentioned a lot is just wouldn't be as expensive to maintain maybe if we didn't have to replace the poles all the time. Maybe that would fix a lot of the issue. There's a bit of pushback on that solution because it might be easier to maintain. They're more stable. That's a lot of other countries have started to use those underground power lines, but it's not like we don't have power right now. So no one really wants to, do the preventative measure to address the issue. But that is an alternative. You can try and reduce climate change because climate change is what is producing these weather calamities that are creating the global warming, right? What's the name of the trading bloc that Russia, Brazil, and South Africa are in? Oh, goodness. All I have in my head is BRICS, but I know it's not BRICS. That's a different thing. Okay, so Cody is asking, what is the name of the trading bloc that Russia, Brazil, and South Africa are in? Does anyone want to look that up so we have the answer on the lecture? Because there are a couple regional organizations that agree to sell oil. So I would love if someone could Google that for me. Okay, other ways to address these power disruptions, increasing our cybersecurity, right? If we can make it harder to hack or DOS our cities, that would be great. Arissa is suggesting MRIC, M-R-I-C, for that organization. No, I think that Cody is talking about a specifically oil-based organization. BRICS is like a developing countries kind of group they do cooperate with each other economically. I'm not sure if it's specifically oil though, so I guess Cody can help clarify if that's what he said. To kind of address, or at least demonstrate to you guys, beyond, like the silly one of the Super Bowl, that, the power disruptions can create pretty big issues. This is New York in 1977 when its power got knocked out. It had pretty much like rolling blackouts for a lot of that year. That summer was pretty rough. They had mass looting in the streets, lots of crime. If you guys are true crime people, Son of Sam happens in the city during this time. So you can definitely say that there's a lot of civil unrest and violence and crime happening because they don't have power, right? It's really hot. There's no air conditioning. There's no lights. It's a lot harder to create security in the city, all because the power went out, right? So it's definitely something that is relevant to our national security. Maybe it's not, a super, super common event, but we have seen it and we have seen the negative repercussions of it. Okay, so kind of leading into that Son of Sam example I just said, how can political instability contribute to these issues, right? So we've talked about how instability in other countries can contribute to this, but what about within the United States? Worker strikes. So there aren't a ton of those nowadays, but a large part of that is because of the Taft-Hartley Act that got passed in 1947 that put a lot of restrictions on how workers could strike. Essentially, it created restrictions on unions and essentially created a time limit on how long they could strike for. So after 80 days, they had to go back to work if the president ordered it. So it's not super an issue, but historically there have been major disruptions in our power supply when coal miners or other kind of, energy providing groups have gone on strike. And then infrastructure destruction. So I know that, is it PG&E? PG&E has been blamed for a lot of the forest fires that are happening in California, right? Because most of those, or at least a few of them, big ones, can be attributed to poor maintenance of their power lines, right? That's what caused those fires and also massive power blackouts in the region. Essentially, what we find, and I've got a citation for you if you want to look into it yourself, is that when you have political stability, you have more funding for infrastructure. And they go even further to say that it's not just that it's like peaceful, they also mean that people vote the same way all the time, that there's not a lot of, back and forth switching between parties, that there's similar goals, there's consistent goals over time. When you have that, that's when you get that major infrastructure funding, and that's one of the ways that we can try and prevent these power disruptions. Or at least that's what can prevent power disruptions. I don't say how we can, because I think it's a hard ask to try and make people vote consistently all the time. That doesn't, make a lot of ethical sense, not realistic, but that's one pattern that we've seen in political science. Okay, so let's look at that kind of newer, more modern take on these environmental factors, right? Climate change. What you're seeing is when biodiversity gets reduced and when deforestation happens, you see higher levels of insecurity, right? And when we're talking about insecurity, that can mean conflict and state failure, as we've seen, or weather-based calamities and other kind of restrictions in our ability to access the resources we need. So there's been a bit of, I'm not saying inconsistent literature in political science that's trying to look at how climate change affects countries as a whole, right? So I've got this one from Gleich from 2014 that's actually looking at water access and how that kind of was connected to the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. But I will say there is a lot of debate in that literature right now. So if you want to look into it, you can. There isn't a lot of consistency in results. I think there's a lot of difficulty in how you measure something as broad as climate change, specifically so you can get, you want to understand that specific relationship. But climate change is a bunch of different things going on, and there's other stuff going on that you need to control for, and it makes it kind of difficult to empirically assess it. So you'll see a lot of debate in that literature if you want to look at it. So what we have seen, though, is that flooding, fires, and electrical storms become more frequent when we've got climate change. This is my fancy way of saying that the more fuel we burn, the worse climate change gets, which makes us have less access to fuel, which makes it hotter. So like the negative effects kind of compound when we keep using those non-renewable resources that contribute to it. But what we see overall is that climate change can affect national power, state failure, violent conflict, right? People get upset when it's really hot, or when there's a drought, they get angry, they fight each other. Or it's harder for a country to stay stable because they don't have access to the power supply that they need. Or honestly, it's just, it's really hard to run a country when you're in a drought, or you've got a bunch of hurricanes hitting, or a big wildfire, right? So all of these things can show how climate change is affecting the state's national security. And then if you want to explore it in a prettier chart than what I had up here, a beautiful chart from your reading, which essentially looks at each of the components of climate change and how that can contribute to those kind of main topics that were listed. So how it can contribute to national power, state failure, and conflict. So if we look at heat waves can create pandemics, which means that there's greater heat. We need to address the climate change to prevent some of these issues, right? And I just picked pandemics because that's, the one we're in right now. But all of these things can have their own effects in different ways on how the country is working. Hopefully we don't get to the riot stage. We've just got angry people right now, but no riots, so that's good. Yeah. Any questions on that stuff so far? Cool. All right. You let me know if you have any questions that come up. I just think this is like a weird predictive table because this article was written in 2011 and it pretty much showed us exactly, what's going on in the world. Okay, so what are some other weather calamities and natural disasters that we would need to be addressing if we're looking at these kinds of concerns? Last summer, 2 summers ago, oh my gosh, was that 2 summers ago? Wildfires, right? The biggest one that California's ever had, the Camp Fire, killed 85, I think 200 went missing. They're not really sure where they are. over 6,000 wildfire land, so a lot of California burn. And there's a really big concern about how you address that, because part of the problem is that as climate change gets worse, you have longer droughts. Droughts means drier forests, which means bigger forest fires, or they need, less of a spark. And they're being addressed by the U.S. military. So the Senate committee, the House Armed Services Committee, has actually integrated responding to forest fires into their concerns, not only out of the goodness of their hearts, but because forest fires are actually affecting the military pretty significantly. National Guard and Coast Guard are two of the ones that most commonly get deployed to address forest fires. Coast Guard tools and equipment are used usually to try and prevent or at least knock down those fires. So it actually can have a significant effect on the military, even if that's not the branch of the military that's supposed to be dealing with those issues, or even if it's just a state concern. So that accesses military resources and then reduces training availability, right? It's hard to keep your military in tip-top shape or train them for conflicts that we're entering into if they're all fighting forest fires, right? Okay, if you do want to look at some more direct relationships, or a lot of other studies that have been going on that draw that connection between climate change, weather calamities, and outcomes within states. So like how it affects conflict or infrastructure funding or any other kind of general concerns that we've talked about, you can go here. This is the bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. They do an annual report that is literally how has extreme weather affected other things in the country. And they have a bunch of different studies that they do every year that are really interesting, but they're just so diverse, I didn't think I could cover them all here clearly. But they look at how decreases in rainfall, so how do droughts affect things? How does flooding affect things, an increase in rainfall? What do fires do? Does it affect conflict? Does it affect funding? How many fights people get into, right? All of these things can be connected to these kinds of irregular weather behaviors. Okay, so how can we address these things, right? Again, act sustainably, maybe try and use renewable resources, reducing CO2 and other greenhouse gases, recycle. These are all, things that we've talked about a lot when you hear that discussion of climate change, but I did want to show that there's some pushback against saying climate change is something that's a national security issue. I didn't want to just, say it definitely is, because, political science, we can never have 100% of an answer. We're not a hard science, but there are some counter arguments for including climate change in our discussion of environmental security. First off, is it something that the state needs to be addressing from a security standpoint, or is it more of a humanitarian issue, right? So I know that we had that in the first week where some of you guys asked if we could talk about humanitarian concerns, and in all honesty, that's not really a national security issue, right? It's not that, the populace as a whole isn't safe, or that, someone's threatening violence. Those are people that are being oppressed, or it's, something where human rights aren't being protected, or it's like a more global effect. It's not something within the country. From a national security standpoint, it's a more global humanitarian concern. As a species of humans, that's how we should be approaching it, not internally from each state. Another argument is that they call them black swan events. Once in a lifetime, once in 100 years events. There's no way you can prepare for those things. They're just, random acts of nature. There's no security policy that we could do to prevent it, so why even try, right? Another way to be concerned about this is it a good or a bad thing to connect climate change and how we respond to the issues of it from a military standpoint? So, and I'll put this one to you guys. I think this is the one where I can probably get more immediate opinions from you guys. Do you think it's good or bad to associate our responses to climate change with military, like with our military policy or with military actions? Okay, so Haley says it definitely makes it look like we take it seriously when it's connected with the military. So we're sending a strong signal, definitely. Hannah says that it just builds more issues with the military industrial complex. So yeah, are we integrating issues that we already have with the military to an environmental issue that already has its own concerns? Cody says it's something to take into consideration, but it probably shouldn't be based entirely around the military. Okay, so maybe use the resources, but don't connect it super strongly. I can see that. I think there's a lot of different ways to look at it, you know, pros and cons to both sides to get the access to military resources and funding, but all that comes with that, you know, the bureaucracy, the outside influences potentially, and then the more nationalized reaction to it, right? Then you move it out of something that maybe each state does on its own to address its own environmental concerns. It becomes a more national policy. So does California have the same environmental concerns that North Dakota has, right? They're probably a bit different, so it might not address each state correctly. Yeah, awesome. Okay, and then, like I said before, does it actually cause conflict? The literature is inconsistent. I think part of that is just a measurement issue where we don't know how to measure climate change consistently. There's so many different things that it could be causing. How are we accurately understanding the relationship? But maybe that's something for future researchers to do, maybe. Okay. So if we look at the institutions that are connected to this, oh, sorry, I moved topics. I didn't even read my slide. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about today is the nuclear waste or nuclear energy component of the idea of environmental security. So the institutions that we have for that is still the EPA. It's still that kind of, you know, environmental agency conglomeration that we talked about at the beginning. Baudry is asking, can FEMA be in charge of climate change response? FEMA is designed to respond to like natural disasters. So it definitely plays a part in it, but they're more responsive. They're not preventative, right? So it would either, at least in my, wanted to act preventatively instead of responsively. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of debate and kind of, what's the word? Controversy about how FEMA is used and when it is applied. So I think possibly, but there would be a lot of debate on it. We'd be seeing a lot of arguing, for sure. Okay, nuclear contamination and fuel waste. So when we're looking at nuclear sites that have, you know, leftover fuel, radioactive material, when you use nuclear energy to, you know, in your power plant, it leaves behind radioactive material that's left over. It's kind of like the, you know, the ash that's left over when you burn coal. You have this radioactive ash stuff that's left over. The only problem is that that stuff is radioactive and dangerous for people and the environment and animals, everything, for thousands of years. So pretty much forever. It will always be radioactive, and we need to have a good way to clean that kind of stuff up, right? Because it's really useful fuel-wise. It's very clean energy. It doesn't put out those dangerous gases. You can create a lot of heat from very little amount of nuclear material. The only problem is cleaning up the leftovers, essentially. So the EPA is in charge of cleaning up those kinds of sites. They maintain active sites and abandoned sites. What they want to do is monitor them to prevent exposure to radiation. They also clean and identify those sites under something called the Superfund program, which is just kind of, I think, like the subsidiary of the EPA that's in charge of looking at this radiation issue. They have some current goals that they're looking at. They want to speed up cleanup, make the responsible parties pay. So they're not going to clean up after everyone for everything, right? Like they might have the tools, but that doesn't mean that companies can be willy-nilly about using these kinds of things. They want to maybe gather some private investment, redevelop and revitalize the sites and kind of the cities around those areas, right? And then engage in their partners. So you can explore that fund a little bit more yourselves if you want to, but that's kind of how the United States has responded to cleaning up different radioactive issues that we've got within our border. Okay, so this is more of like a sociological issue or a cultural issue that I think is a national security issue, but it is something that's far, far in the future, right? This is something we need to be concerned about for 1,000 years. So way after we all die, how can we make sure that people understand where we've put that nuclear waste, right? So we know that it's difficult to store already. You have to plan the site over, thousands of years of erosion. So they have to be low enough in the ground that when the ground erodes away, that they're still going to be secure. When earthquakes happen, are they still secure? So there's a lot of different things that countries already have to address when they're trying to store their nuclear waste. But I think one of the biggest is what we know commonly as our nuclear radiation symbol. It was invented in the 40s, I believe. Does anything about the symbol, I know that we know what it means, but does anything about this shape convey to you that there's nuclear radiation on the site? You can just say yes or no if you want. Paige says no. Yeah, it's triangles in a circle, right? It doesn't really, yeah, Savannah agrees. There's nothing really that tells you that, beyond being told by someone else that that's what that symbol is trying to convey. So a lot of countries have been trying to figure out, how do you convey danger, sickness, don't open this door, don't open this box, don't eat it, don't let it get into the water. How do you convey that with a symbol or with something else? Because we don't know what they're going to be doing, 1,000 years from now. There's been suggestions that maybe we have a sign that has a man and he walks up to a barrel of radioactive waste and then he's sick when he leaves, right? But when you do that, some countries read left to right and some read right to left. So if you read it the other way around, it's a sick man who gets into a barrel and becomes healthy. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. You could do skull and crossbones. That might convey danger, but that's only because that's the historical context we've got with that image, right? That's how we view, like pirates and danger. But do we know that that's going to be how that symbol is viewed, centuries from now, right? So there have been a lot of proposals that have been put out, different types of signs. Can we write, like danger or sickness or death? Can you just put a skull and crossbones? That one has been floated around for sure. How can you convey this if we don't have a language, if people aren't speaking, if it's literally an entirely different species, right, in the world at that point? How do you tell them, don't go to this area, don't dig in this place? This is one proposed solution. It's just a field of spikes. Can you just make that area look super creepy and super unwelcoming and kind of dangerous? Okay, Hannah says that symbol is actually also poison control. Yeah, right, because it just means bad for you. That's what that symbol means to us, usually like toxic. So even the way that our culture understands that symbol can vary a lot. So they've tried to propose things like this that just kind of give off a dangerous vibe. But what do people do when they're told something's dangerous? I mean, we're humans, we're kind of, curious jerks. So when things are dangerous, they might be exciting. There might be a mystery down there, right? I mean, that was the Egyptian tombs, wasn't it? Where they put all the symbols in the world that said, do not enter, keep out, dangerous. And we even had people getting sick when they went into those tombs. And we said, yeah, maybe there's a mystery in there, right? Humans are curious people. So this one might not be the best option. Katie says, yeah, look, it's ghost hunters and stuff. Yeah, exactly. We're just going to get a bunch of ghost hunters climbing all over spikes, getting radiated. One proposal is to do something like that. It's literally just make the plant life in that area the wrong color, an unnatural color, and hopefully maybe that will convey it to people that something is wrong here, right? But again, who knows what plants will look like 10,000 years from now, you know? Will they all be that color? From more like other more modern man-made structures, this is the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. So this is a country that experienced that kind of pain and knows that radiation. And it's a symbol that at least I in my head didn't immediately associate with like nuclear, you know, blast or nuclear radiation, but it's just like a beautiful little arch, right? That's how that architect can, you know, interpreted that event. But I think that it's different for everyone that looks at it, right? So if we, because people have said maybe you put statues up, maybe that's the easiest way to do it. Those can stand the test of time. You know, we still see statues from like Greek and Roman times. So maybe that's the way to do it. But then those are so up for interpretation too, that we're not sure if the message would get across clearly. There's been other pushes for creepy children's nursery rhymes. So something like Ring Around the Rosie for the Black Plague, right? Could we do something how you identify it? Haley asks why it looks so pretty. It's a peace memorial. I think it's definitely like a place of quiet contemplation and remembrance. Yeah. I'm using this more as like an example of how there's so much variation and how individuals interpret what that kind of, you know, damage actually looks like. If you try and put it into a medium like a sculpture, that it can mean vastly different things, or you can portray it with big angry spikes or something peaceful like that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so are they trying, Hannah's saying maybe they're not trying to convey the disaster, more like, or they're trying to reflect on the disaster, not convey a warning. Yeah. Yeah. So it could be. And then, yeah, Brian is talking about the building in the background that actually survived the bomb and it's kind of all destroyed. And Haley agrees, yeah. So there's a lot, it really depends on, yeah, what you want to convey with that kind of an image, right? So they're conveying the disaster that happened, maybe some peaceful reflection, or, you know, like a recognition of that event. But is that, you know, does everyone's interpretation of that statue, you know, get across the same message, right? That, you know, I mean, look at Chernobyl now, right? We put the HBO show out and now everyone's climbing over all of that stuff and like taking photos in it. It's still radioactive. We can't, even the symbols we've got right now apparently don't convey to people that that's not a safe place to be. So you really got to figure out how can you embed something in the culture when maybe language changes, you know, the generations change, maybe the landscape changes. How do you make sure that that kind of warning stays? But do you guys have any other questions for me about this week? I'm gonna end the stream right here, but if you have any, I'll leave the chat up and I can respond to you on there. So thank you guys so much. Yeah, just submit your drafts to me and then I'll try and get those switched out for peer reviews as soon as possible. Have a good day.